The early morning stillness of Maplewood, New Jersey, was abruptly shattered by the piercing wail of sirens. It was 4 a.m. on a chilly February night when Alan Thorne's panicked voice crackled over the 911 line. He spoke in hurried, frantic bursts, telling the dispatcher that a masked intruder had broken into his home and attacked his wife, Vanessa, as they lay sleeping. His tone was desperate, filled with fear, as he described how his wife was covered in blood, lying motionless in their bedroom. The dispatcher tried to calm him, assuring that help was on the way. Maplewood was known for its serene streets lined with well-kept homes, the kind of suburban paradise where families felt safe and neighbors greeted each other with a smile. Alan's frantic call struck at the heart of that illusion, and within minutes, flashing red and blue lights reflected off the quiet, tree-lined avenue. Police cars and an ambulance pulled up to the Thorne residence, a large, stately colonial with a perfectly manicured lawn. As paramedics rushed inside, they found Alan standing in the hallway, pale and visibly shaken, his clothes stained with blood. He pointed towards the master bedroom, barely able to form coherent words. Inside, they found Vanessa sprawled across the bed, unconscious and bleeding profusely. A bloody kitchen knife lay discarded on the floor beside the bed. One paramedic immediately applied pressure to the gaping wound on her abdomen, while another prepared a stretcher. There was no time to lose. Vanessa's pulse was weak, her breath shallow, and every second counted. Meanwhile, outside the house, neighbors began to gather, awakened by the commotion. The usually quiet neighborhood was now abuzz with nervous whispers and speculation. A few of them were still in their pajamas, watching anxiously from their porches. Mr. Kearney, the elderly man who lived next door, mentioned he had heard shouting earlier in the night, but he had assumed it was just another heated argument between Alan and Vanessa, which wasn't uncommon in recent months. Across the street, Mrs. Alvarez, a single mother, clutched her bathrobe tightly around herself. She told a police officer that she hadn't heard anything unusual until the sirens arrived. Her teenage son, Lucas, however, mentioned seeing a figure near the Thornes' back door shortly before midnight. It was a fleeting glance, and he couldn't be sure if it was someone sneaking around or just a shadow in the darkness. Detective Henry Collins arrived at the scene shortly after the paramedics, taking in the tense atmosphere. The once peaceful Maplewood was now a crime scene. The house was quickly cordoned off, yellow police tape fluttering in the cold breeze as curious onlookers were pushed back behind the barricade. Henry watched as Vanessa was rushed out on a stretcher, her face pale and lifeless. Alan remained in the living room, his hands shaking as he clutched a glass of water, trying to regain his composure. Detective Collins introduced himself and asked Alan to recount what had happened. Alan's words were disjointed, his voice breaking as he described waking to the sounds of glass shattering downstairs, then a masked figure appearing in their bedroom. The intruder, Alan claimed, had lunged at Vanessa, stabbing her repeatedly before fleeing out the back door. Alan said he had fought back, but the assailant overpowered him. The story seemed clear, yet something felt off to the detective. Collins asked Alan to sit tight while he surveyed the scene. The detective's eyes roamed the immaculate interior of the house, the elegant furniture, the tasteful artwork, the polished floors, searching for any signs of forced entry. There were none. No broken windows, no jimmied locks, nothing to indicate that someone had broken into the house. It didn't add up. Returning to the living room, Collins noticed Alan's agitation had subsided. He seemed strangely composed, his earlier panic giving way to a calm that struck the detective as odd given the circumstances. He asked Alan if there was any security system in place. Alan nodded, explaining they had security cameras installed just a few months ago, a precaution they had taken after a minor burglary in the neighborhood. Collins requested access to the security footage. Alan hesitated, his eyes shifting uncomfortably, but he quickly agreed, mentioning that he had turned off the cameras before going to bed because they had malfunctioned the night before. A small, nearly imperceptible smile crossed Alan's face as he spoke, one that didn't sit well with the seasoned detective. Outside, neighbors were still gathered, anxious for any news. Maplewood had never experienced a crime of this magnitude. In a town where the biggest scandal was a PTA meeting gone awry, the idea of a violent home invasion was unthinkable. The residents whispered among themselves, sharing theories about what could have gone wrong. Some speculated it was a robbery gone bad. Others suggested it was a personal vendetta. Mrs. Alvarez, recalling her son's sighting of a shadowy figure, told the police about it, and they took notes, though there was little to go on. As the ambulance pulled away, taking Vanessa to the hospital, Detective Collins stood on the Thornes' porch, watching Alan as he sat inside, staring blankly at the floor. The story didn't sit right. But there was still much to uncover. A mystery had unfolded that cold February morning in Maplewood. And it was just the beginning. The police investigations into the Thorne household had just begun, and Maplewood was buzzing with rumors. Detective Henry Collins, the lead investigator, knew that the key to solving the mystery lay in understanding who Alan and Vanessa truly were. What appeared to be a straightforward case of a home invasion had already started to crumble. And now, it was time to delve into the lives of those involved. Alan Thorne, by all outward appearances, was a man who had it all. Raised in a modest Midwestern town, he had built a reputation as a hard-working, reliable figure in his community. He was known to attend church regularly and was involved in several local charities. After earning a degree in computer science, he moved up the ranks quickly in the tech industry, eventually becoming a highly sought-after consultant. He was not a flashy man. His wealth was evident in the form of his stately home and tastefully understated luxury vehicles. But Alan prided himself on his humility. His first marriage to Julia Evans had been stable and ordinary by all accounts. They had married young, and for 20 years they were a fixture in the local community, attending neighborhood BBQs, school fundraisers, and holiday gatherings. Their 2 sons, Ethan and Grant, were the center of their world. But as the boys grew older, something in the marriage shifted. Alan's demanding career required frequent travel, and Julia's contentment with a simpler life seemed to clash with Alan's drive for success. The divorce, though amicable, had left a mark on Alan. He stayed in touch with his sons, who had gone off to college, and soon found himself alone in the large house that now seemed too quiet. Vanessa Cruz entered his life just when he thought he had settled into his new reality. A lively, charismatic nurse from a working-class neighborhood in New Jersey, Vanessa had a magnetic personality that was hard to resist. Alan had met her on a dating website, and the connection was instant. Her warmth and zest for life were in stark contrast to Julia's more reserved demeanor. Vanessa was impulsive, spontaneous, and brought a spark back to Alan's life that he thought he had lost. They married just 2 years after meeting, and she moved into his Maplewood home, quickly becoming the center of his world. But not everyone was happy with the changes Vanessa brought into Alan's life. Ethan and Grant, his 2 sons, found it difficult to adjust to their father's new wife. They described her as overly friendly, even intrusive, always pushing herself into family matters where she didn't quite belong. Ethan, the more outspoken of the 2, openly clashed with Vanessa at family dinners, making his discomfort known. Grant, on the other hand, quietly withdrew, distancing himself from his father and stepmother. Vanessa's attempts to bond with Alan's sons were met with indifference, and soon she stopped trying. Instead, she turned her attention to the social scene in Maplewood, organizing charity events and trying to ingratiate herself with the community. But whispers began to circulate, whispers about her spending habits, her fondness for wine, and her occasional outbursts at local gatherings. Alan, who had always been a private man, seemed uncomfortable with the sudden social spotlight. Yet, he stood by Vanessa, defending her to those who questioned her intentions. It wasn't long before tensions began to show. Arguments between Alan and Vanessa became more frequent, often overheard by the neighbors. Mr. Kearney, who lived next door, recalled hearing a particularly loud confrontation just a month before the attack, with Vanessa's raised voice accusing Alan of being controlling and distant. Alan's quiet responses were harder to discern, but the tone was unmistakably defensive. Detective Collins took note of the subtle shifts in Alan's demeanor as he spoke about his wife. When asked to describe Vanessa, Alan's tone would become strained, his words careful. He emphasized her kindness, her dedication to her job as a nurse, and her efforts to bring the community together. Yet, there were pauses, moments where he seemed to search for the right words, almost as if afraid to say something that would cast Vanessa in a negative light. It was clear that beneath the polished surface, their marriage had not been as idyllic as it seemed. The detective also learned more about Vanessa's background, which provided a sharp contrast to Alan's stable middle-class upbringing. Vanessa had grown up in a rougher part of Newark, New Jersey, where financial instability was a constant worry. Her mother had struggled with alcoholism, and Vanessa had practically raised her 2 younger siblings. Determined to escape the cycle of poverty, she put herself through nursing school, working double shifts and living frugally until she could afford a better life. Her marriage to Alan had been a chance to step into a different world, a world of wealth and comfort that she had never known. But old habits die hard, and some of Vanessa's rough edges remained. Her fondness for expensive clothing, jewelry, and high-end vacations began to strain the household budget, something that clashed with Alan's fiscally conservative nature. Neighbors noted that Vanessa seemed to always have the latest designer handbags and shoes, often bragging about her purchases at social events. Alan, who had never been materialistic, found himself growing resentful of Vanessa's extravagance, though he rarely voiced his concerns in public. Detective Collins began piecing together a timeline of events that seemed to hint at an impending crisis. From interviews with friends and family, he learned that Vanessa had confided to a close friend that she felt trapped in the marriage, describing Alan as cold and manipulative. In turn, Alan's co-workers mentioned he had become more withdrawn and seemed distracted at meetings, hinting that his personal life was weighing heavily on him. The first significant incident occurred a few months before the February attack. Vanessa had thrown an elaborate party for Alan's 50th birthday, a gathering of the town's most influential residents, complete with catering, a live band, and a lavish bar. It was the kind of party that Maplewood rarely saw, and while it was a night of luxury, Alan appeared strangely uncomfortable, forcing a smile for the sake of his guests. Several attendees noticed that he barely spoke to Vanessa that night, and the tension between them was palpable. After the guests left, a neighbor reported seeing Alan's sons leaving the house abruptly, their faces tight with anger. It was the kind of detail that seemed small at the time, but in retrospect, it was just another crack in the Thornes' carefully maintained facade. Detective Collins noted every detail, aware that these seemingly insignificant moments often held the key to understanding the bigger picture. As he continued his investigations, Collins couldn't shake the feeling that Alan's narrative of a home invasion didn't add up. He decided it was time to dig deeper into Vanessa's life and see if there were any clues that could explain why a night that began like any other in Maplewood had ended in violence. The story was just beginning, and Collins was determined to uncover the truth, no matter how deeply it was buried beneath the surface of Alan and Vanessa's marriage. Detective Henry Collins continued his methodical investigation as Vanessa Cruz lay in critical condition at St. Vincent's Hospital. As more information surfaced, the seemingly perfect facade of Alan and Vanessa's marriage was beginning to fracture. The Maplewood community, initially quick to support Alan, now harbored a growing sense of unease. Whispers of doubt circulated through the neighborhood, and the Thorne household's carefully curated image was collapsing under the weight of the scrutiny. Alan Thorne, a respected figure in his suburban community, had been known for his stable and quiet life before his second marriage. His previous marriage to Julia Evans had been a stable and predictable union, one that spanned 2 decades and produced 2 sons, Ethan and Grant. By all accounts, Alan had been a devoted husband and father, actively participating in local events, fundraisers, and social gatherings that defined Maplewood's close-knit community. However, his demanding career had taken its toll, and the amicable divorce left Alan feeling adrift, unsure of what direction his life would take next. Vanessa's arrival had been a whirlwind, bringing excitement and change. She was a nurse with a dynamic personality, someone who seemed to relish the attention and social opportunities Maplewood offered. In contrast to Julia's quiet and reserved nature, Vanessa was vibrant, impulsive, and eager to immerse herself in the local social scene. Their relationship had started with passion and spontaneity, but over time, the differences between Alan's traditional values and Vanessa's more extravagant tastes became a source of conflict. Alan's sons, Ethan and Grant, had struggled to accept the changes in their father's life. Vanessa's attempts to bond with them had been met with cool indifference, and as the months passed, she stopped trying altogether. Instead, she sought validation in Maplewood's social circles, hosting increasingly elaborate gatherings that clashed with Alan's more conservative lifestyle. Her spending habits became a point of contention, as designer clothes, luxury vacations, and extravagant parties began to strain the couple's finances. Neighbors began to notice the tension. There were late-night arguments that carried through the thin suburban walls, sudden silences that followed bouts of shouting, and strained smiles that masked a deeper discontent. The once tight-knit Thorne family began to unravel, their connections strained by the undercurrents of resentment and disillusionment that defined the marriage. A sense of unease settled over the neighborhood, as those who had once admired the Thornes now began to wonder what lay beneath the surface. The tension reached a peak during Alan's 50th birthday party. Vanessa had organized an elaborate event, inviting Maplewood's most influential residents, arranging expensive catering, and ensuring every detail exuded sophistication and elegance. Yet, the celebration was far from joyful. Alan's forced smiles and the obvious distance between him and Vanessa did not go unnoticed. His sons, Ethan and Grant, left the party early, their expressions cold and tense, adding to the growing sense that something was terribly wrong within the Thorne household. As the investigation continued, Detective Collins interviewed friends, neighbors, and anyone who might shed light on what had been happening behind the closed doors of the Thorne residence. Alan's closest friends described him as increasingly withdrawn in recent months, hinting that his personal life was unraveling. Financial records revealed large, unexplained cash withdrawals, and there were indications that Vanessa had consulted a divorce attorney just weeks before the February incident. Vanessa's friends painted a contrasting picture, revealing that she had long felt trapped in the marriage. They described a relationship marked by control, financial manipulation, and emotional strain. Vanessa had once confided in a close friend that she feared Alan would use his influence and wealth against her if she tried to leave. The financial pressures, combined with their social obligations, seemed to push the couple closer to the breaking point with each passing month. Neighbors also contributed pieces of the puzzle. One recalled seeing Vanessa alone on the porch, smoking and drinking, her frustration evident in her tense posture. Another mentioned that Alan's behavior had become increasingly erratic, especially in the weeks leading up to the attack. He was often seen late at night, pacing outside or sitting silently on the porch, staring into the darkness as if grappling with a burden he could not share. Evidence from the scene began to corroborate the stories of a marriage under strain. Financial documents pointed to deepening debts and frequent disagreements over money. Forensic analysis suggested that the crime scene did not align with Alan's initial account of a home invasion. Bloodstain patterns indicated a direct, close-quarters assault, and the lack of forced entry raised doubts about the supposed intruder. A crucial discovery came when investigators found Vanessa's journal hidden in a drawer in the master bedroom. Its pages, filled with emotional confessions and unguarded thoughts, painted a picture of a woman struggling under the weight of a toxic relationship. The entries detailed arguments over finances, Alan's distant demeanor, and Vanessa's growing resentment. The final pages hinted at her plans to leave, reflecting a desperate hope for a new start away from the confines of the Thorne residence. The journal's contents aligned with the growing body of evidence that pointed away from a random break-in and towards a premeditated act of violence. Financial records, testimony from friends, and the strained relationship with Alan's sons added further depth to the narrative of a marriage in turmoil. Each new revelation seemed to draw Collins closer to understanding the truth about what had happened on that February night. As he delved deeper, the case took on a darker tone. The investigation was no longer about a supposed home invasion. It was about uncovering the reality of a relationship that had been disintegrating for years. The once perfect life that Alan and Vanessa had tried to maintain was nothing more than a fragile illusion, now shattered and exposed. Detective Collins knew the answers he sought lay buried beneath layers of deception, and each new piece of evidence brought him closer to the truth. The Thorne marriage, which had once seemed like a beacon of success and prosperity in Maplewood, was now a cautionary tale, a warning of how quickly a life built on appearances could collapse when the cracks were too deep to hide. The case was far from over, and Collins braced himself for the challenges ahead. As he prepared to delve further into the complex dynamics of Alan and Vanessa's marriage, he knew the investigation would only become more intricate, revealing secrets that neither the Thornes nor the Maplewood community were prepared to face. Detective Henry Collins felt the weight of the case growing heavier as he continued to examine the evidence gathered from the Thorne household. The pristine neighborhood of Maplewood, with its clean-cut lawns and quiet streets, was still reeling from the news of the violent incident inside the Thorne residence. What had initially appeared to be a simple case of a home invasion was unraveling into something far more complex. It was the early morning hours of February 3rd when the 911 call had come in. Alan's trembling voice had described a masked intruder attacking his wife, Vanessa, as they slept. The emergency responders had arrived swiftly, but nothing about the crime scene had matched Alan's story. Vanessa, gravely injured, had been found sprawled across the bed in the master bedroom, a deep wound in her abdomen, and bloody cuts marking her wrists. A kitchen knife, the presumed weapon, lay discarded on the floor, smeared with blood. As paramedics rushed Vanessa to the hospital, the forensic team moved in, meticulously cataloging every detail. The bedroom was eerily immaculate, aside from the chaos of the blood. No signs of forced entry, no broken windows or doors, and no evidence of a struggle consistent with an intruder. Collins noted the absence of any disturbances that might suggest a break-in, a detail that would later become a critical component of the investigation. Back at the station, the detectives reviewed the preliminary forensic analysis. Bloodstain patterns indicated that the attack had likely occurred while Vanessa was lying down, directly contradicting Alan's account of a chaotic struggle. The discovery of blood traces on Alan's clothes suggested close proximity during the assault. More concerning, however, was the absence of any defensive wounds on Alan's hands, a stark contradiction to his claim of having fought off an intruder. While Vanessa remained unconscious in intensive care, Collins decided to press further. He requested the security footage that Alan had mentioned, hoping it would shed light on the incident. When the footage was reviewed, however, there were curious gaps. The cameras, which Alan claimed had malfunctioned the night before, were inexplicably off during the critical hours of the attack. The footage picked up again only after the 911 call had been made, showing a flustered Alan waiting anxiously for the arrival of emergency responders. These inconsistencies led Collins to take a harder look at Alan's behavior. The calmness he exhibited after the attack, his ability to provide a detailed account without hesitation, and the strange smile he had given when discussing the malfunctioning cameras all gnawed at Collins' instincts. The detective knew that experienced liars often hid behind a facade of confidence. But Alan's story was beginning to crumble under the weight of the evidence. At St. Vincent's Hospital, Vanessa's condition had stabilized enough for doctors to allow the detectives a brief interview. Weak and struggling to speak, Vanessa provided a version of events that diverged sharply from her husband's narrative. According to her, the argument with Alan had started earlier in the evening at a local restaurant, where tensions over finances and Alan's recent behavior had boiled over. They had returned home separately, Vanessa in her car and Alan in his, both seething with frustration. Vanessa had gone straight to the master bedroom, attempting to calm herself by lying down and focusing on her breathing. She described drifting in and out of restless sleep, only to be jolted awake by a searing pain in her abdomen. When she opened her eyes, she saw Alan standing over her, a knife in his hand, his expression cold and detached. In the dim light of the bedroom, she had screamed for help, but no one came. Alan, she claimed, had told her to stay silent, threatening her life if she didn't comply with his plan to stage the scene as a robbery gone wrong. Vanessa's words were damning, and Collins could feel the shift in the case's momentum. The narrative of a random break-in was becoming increasingly implausible. He left the hospital with a sense of purpose, determined to uncover the truth behind the contradictions. Meanwhile, the forensic analysis provided further clarity. The blood evidence indicated a methodical and targeted attack, with the knife wounds placed in ways that suggested a deliberate attempt to incapacitate. There were no fingerprints on the kitchen knife aside from Alan's, reinforcing the theory that no intruder had been present. The forensic team also discovered traces of Vanessa's blood on Alan's clothes, supporting her account that he had been the one wielding the knife. The evidence was mounting, and Collins felt a growing certainty that Alan was hiding something. However, the detective knew he needed more than circumstantial evidence to solidify the case. The investigation took a new direction when Collins received word from one of Vanessa's friends, Janelle Ortiz, who had agreed to speak confidentially. She provided insight into Vanessa's recent state of mind, describing a woman trapped in a marriage that had turned cold and controlling. Vanessa had expressed fears that Alan was watching her every move, hinting at a desire to escape the confines of the relationship. Collins decided to visit the Thorne residence again, this time focusing on the small details that might have been overlooked. He examined the layout of the house, paying close attention to the master bedroom where the attack had taken place. The room was immaculate, with carefully arranged furniture and tasteful decor, but it felt sterile, almost too perfect. Collins noticed that a drawer in the bedside table was slightly ajar, revealing a stack of unopened envelopes addressed to Vanessa. They were bills, all overdue, suggesting financial stress that Vanessa had never openly shared. In the hallway outside the master bedroom, Collins found another clue. A small, barely noticeable smudge of blood on the doorframe, indicating that Vanessa might have tried to flee before collapsing. It was a detail that solidified his suspicions. If Vanessa had indeed been the victim of a premeditated attack, Alan's calm recounting of events took on a far more sinister tone. Days later, Vanessa regained full consciousness, and the detectives returned to the hospital for a second interview. This time, Vanessa was clear and coherent, recounting the night's events with chilling clarity. She described the moment she realized she was in mortal danger, the sudden, excruciating pain, the icy look in Alan's eyes, and the slow, deliberate manner in which he moved. She spoke of his cold words as he instructed her to lie about an intruder, a desperate effort to control the narrative before the police arrived. Her testimony, combined with the mounting physical evidence, painted a damning picture of premeditation and manipulation. Collins reviewed Vanessa's journal once more, now understanding the weight of the entries she had written in the weeks leading up to the attack. It was clear that Vanessa had been planning to leave Alan, and it was equally clear that Alan had known about it. The entries hinted at Vanessa's fears, her hope for a new beginning, and her growing desperation as she felt her life slipping away. Back at the station, Collins faced Alan in a formal interrogation. He presented the inconsistencies, Vanessa's testimony, the gaps in the security footage, the blood evidence, and watched as Alan's calm facade began to crack. The evasiveness that had initially seemed like shock now felt like a calculated attempt to deceive. Collins knew that he was closing in on the truth, but he also understood that Alan would not break easily. The next phase of the investigation would be crucial, and it was clear that the full story of that February night had yet to be told. As the evidence continued to mount, the illusion of a home invasion faded away, leaving only the stark reality of a marriage that had been unraveling long before the blood was spilled in the Thorne household. The perfect life that Alan and Vanessa had presented to the world was a lie, and Collins was determined to expose every hidden secret. The case was no longer about what happened on that February night. It was about understanding why. And with each new revelation, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, leading Collins closer to the heart of a truth that neither Alan nor the quiet town of Maplewood was prepared to face. Detective Henry Collins had gathered enough evidence to sense the shape of a truth that lay hidden beneath layers of deception. Alan's account of an intruder was unraveling with each new piece of evidence, and Vanessa's testimony had placed the investigation on a different trajectory. The portrait of a home invasion had given way to a much darker, more deliberate narrative, one that Collins was determined to piece together. The initial forensic analysis had shown clear contradictions in Alan's version of events. Bloodstain patterns indicated that the wounds on Vanessa's body were precise and methodical, not the result of a chaotic struggle with an intruder. There were no defensive wounds on Alan, suggesting he hadn't engaged in a physical confrontation, as he had initially claimed. The evidence now pointed to a staged scene rather than a genuine attack. As the investigation intensified, Collins directed his team to focus on the security footage from the Thorne residence. The gaps in the recordings, which Alan had attributed to a technical malfunction, were highly suspect. A forensic technician was able to recover deleted segments from the digital backup, revealing a crucial clue. Alan had manually turned off the cameras the night before the attack. The recovered footage showed him pacing in the living room, moving anxiously through the house, but no sign of an intruder was ever captured. In parallel, Collins began interviewing the neighbors once more, hoping to gather additional context. Several mentioned hearing arguments at the Thorne residence in the weeks leading up to the incident. One neighbor, a retired police officer who lived 2 doors down, had noticed Alan's car parked at odd angles late at night, as if he was trying to obscure its presence. Another neighbor recalled seeing Vanessa frequently leaving the house, her expression tense and agitated. These observations painted a picture of a household strained to its breaking point. Collins decided to bring Alan back in for questioning. This time, the approach was more aggressive. The detective confronted him with the evidence, the gaps in the security footage, the pattern of the knife wounds, and Vanessa's consistent account of the attack. Alan's responses were measured, but Collins noted his slight hesitation, the tightening of his jaw when faced with Vanessa's testimony. The once confident man was beginning to crack, but he remained firm in his insistence that an intruder had been responsible. Despite Alan's defiance, Collins had enough grounds to treat him as a suspect, though more concrete evidence was needed to solidify the case. He returned to the Thorne residence, this time with a warrant, and conducted a meticulous search of the property. It was during this second sweep that Collins found a hidden compartment in Alan's home office, tucked discreetly behind a set of shelves. Inside were financial documents that outlined significant cash withdrawals, transactions that Alan had hidden from Vanessa. The financial documents were damning, records of large cash movements that coincided with Vanessa's private consultations with a divorce attorney. It became clear that Alan had been preparing for a separation and had taken steps to secure his assets long before the attack. The timing of the withdrawal suggested he had been aware of Vanessa's intentions, and this discovery provided a crucial motive. Alan's careful concealment of his finances indicated premeditation, a desperate attempt to maintain control. Meanwhile, Vanessa's recovery continued, and she was able to provide more details about the night of the attack. Her account was clear and unwavering. She described how the argument at the restaurant had escalated to a breaking point, with Alan accusing her of betrayal over their finances and her desire to leave. The confrontation at home had been sudden and violent, and Vanessa remembered Alan's cold expression as he stood over her, knife in hand. She detailed the moments of agony, the fear that gripped her as he ordered her to remain silent and lie about an intruder. Her recollection was consistent with the physical evidence, and Collins knew it would be a crucial component in building a case. Forensic analysis of the knife confirmed Vanessa's account. The blade bore traces of Alan's fingerprints, but there were no signs of anyone else's DNA on the weapon. The investigators now had a compelling combination of forensic evidence, financial motives, and a consistent testimony from the victim that pointed directly at Alan. Collins pieced together a timeline that centered around the night of February 3rd. Each moment, each decision Alan made, pointed to a calculated attempt to control the narrative. From turning off the cameras to staging the scene with precision, Alan's actions reflected a desperation that went beyond the fear of losing a marriage. It was about maintaining an image, securing his financial status, and, perhaps most importantly, ensuring that he was the one in control. However, to move forward with charges, Collins needed to eliminate any remaining doubts. He enlisted the help of a forensic psychologist to profile Alan's behavior, seeking insights into his mindset in the weeks leading up to the attack. The psychologist's analysis suggested a pattern of narcissistic tendencies, an obsession with image, control, and power, that fit with Alan's increasingly erratic behavior and his willingness to manipulate the situation to his advantage. Back at the police station, the detectives reviewed the evidence one final time. The case was solidifying, yet Collins remained cautious. He ordered additional forensic tests on the evidence collected, including Alan's clothes, the knife, and any trace materials found in the bedroom. The results came back in alignment with the initial findings. There was no indication of a second party's involvement, no evidence of an intruder. It was the final confirmation Collins needed. The forensic evidence, financial discrepancies, and Vanessa's consistent testimony formed a web of proof that implicated Alan as the primary suspect. The pieces of the puzzle now fit together, and Collins knew it was time to take the next step. Alan was arrested on charges of attempted murder, and the once esteemed tech consultant was led away in handcuffs, maintaining his innocence even as the weight of the evidence bore down on him. As the case against Alan prepared to move to trial, the mood in Maplewood shifted. The Thorne residence, once a symbol of suburban success, now stood as a reminder of the darkness that had hidden behind its walls. The neighbors who had once admired Alan from a distance now viewed him with suspicion, their conversations filled with speculation and unease. The case had left a mark on the town, and the upcoming trial promised to be a spectacle that would captivate everyone's attention. Collins felt a sense of closure as he watched Alan being taken away. But he knew that the investigation wasn't truly over. The courtroom battle was still to come, and the truth, painful and undeniable, would soon be laid bare for all to see. The threads of the story were finally weaving together into a coherent whole, and the careful facade of Alan's life had been stripped away, exposing the raw reality beneath. The stage was set for the next chapter in the Thorne case, and Collins knew it would be the most challenging yet. The truth was now out in the open, but what remained was the task of convincing a jury to see it clearly, to understand the depths of deception and manipulation that had led to that bloody February night. The trial of Alan Thorne was set to be the most anticipated courtroom event in Maplewood's recent history. For weeks, the town had been captivated by every detail, every new piece of evidence that surfaced. Local and regional news outlets had descended on the courthouse, eager to cover the story of a wealthy businessman whose picture-perfect life had unraveled so violently. The once quiet suburban community was now a focal point for the legal drama that was about to unfold. As the trial began, the prosecution wasted no time laying out their case. They presented a meticulously detailed narrative, weaving together forensic evidence, financial motives, and the chilling testimony of Vanessa Cruz, who had survived to tell her story. The prosecutor described a man desperate to control every aspect of his life, Alan, whose obsession with image and power had driven him to commit an unthinkable act. The evidence was damning. The blood-stained patterns that contradicted Alan's version of events, the gaps in the security footage, the hidden financial records, and, most compellingly, Vanessa's calm and unwavering account of the attack. Vanessa took the stand, her presence a stark contrast to the broken figure she had been months earlier. Her voice was steady as she recounted the events of that February night, the pain, the betrayal, and the fear that had gripped her as Alan hovered over her, knife in hand. She spoke of their fractured marriage, the financial strain, and Alan's increasing attempts to isolate and manipulate her. There was no wavering, no hesitation. Vanessa's testimony was powerful, vivid, and damning. The defense, however, countered with an attempt to discredit her. They painted Vanessa as a volatile, emotionally unstable woman who had exaggerated and manipulated the facts to cast herself as a victim. They argued that the wounds were self-inflicted, a desperate move by a woman whose behavior had become increasingly erratic. They highlighted her drinking habits and the lavish spending, suggesting that her materialism had driven the couple's marriage to the brink. Alan's attorney argued that his client had been a devoted husband, a man who had tried to save a failing marriage until Vanessa's instability forced his hand. As the defense presented their case, Alan sat in stoic silence, his gaze fixed straight ahead, never once looking in Vanessa's direction. His demeanor remained calm and detached, even as witness after witness testified to the turmoil in the Thorne household. Friends, family members, and neighbors were called to the stand, each adding their own perspective on the couple's troubled relationship. Alan's own sons, Ethan and Grant, spoke with visible discomfort, torn between the loyalty they felt for their father and the undeniable evidence against him. The trial dragged on for weeks, with each day revealing new layers of the story. The courtroom became a stage for the unfolding tragedy, a place where secrets were laid bare and the veneer of Alan's carefully constructed life was stripped away. Tensions reached a peak when the forensic psychologist took the stand, offering an analysis of Alan's behavior patterns. A man who had, the psychologist suggested, exhibited signs of emotional manipulation and control, particularly in the weeks leading up to the attack. It was a turning point, and the weight of the evidence seemed to settle heavily over the courtroom. Closing arguments brought the case to a dramatic conclusion. The prosecution urged the jury to see through the facade that Alan had constructed, to recognize the carefully orchestrated steps he had taken to control his wife, and ultimately to destroy her when she threatened to leave. They emphasized the forensic evidence, the financial motive, and the chilling clarity of Vanessa's testimony. The defense, in their final plea, asked the jury to consider the possibility of doubt, to view Alan as a man pushed to the edge by a woman whose unpredictable behavior had driven him to desperation. After days of deliberation, the jury returned to the courtroom. The atmosphere was tense, the silence thick with anticipation. Vanessa sat in the front row, her face a mask of composure, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Alan remained emotionless, his expression unchanging as the verdict was read. Guilty of attempted first-degree murder. The courtroom erupted. Gasps and murmurs filled the space, followed by the shouts of reporters and the flash of cameras. Alan's shoulders sagged, the first real sign of emotion breaking through his composed exterior. The judge, firm and resolute, delivered the sentence: 35 years in state prison, a decision that reflected the gravity of the crime and the premeditation that had led to it. The weight of the sentence was clear. Given Alan's age, it was likely a life sentence. Vanessa, upon hearing the verdict, let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The long, grueling months of recovery, of reliving the trauma in the courtroom, had led to this moment. It wasn't a victory, but it was a form of justice, an acknowledgement that the truth she had fought so hard to tell had been heard and believed. She remained seated, tears streaming silently down her face. As the courtroom slowly emptied around her, Maplewood, once defined by its quiet streets and friendly neighborhoods, was forever changed. The Thorne residence, a stately house that had once symbolized suburban success, was sold at a fraction of its value, left vacant and overgrown, a lingering reminder of the darkness that had unfolded within its walls. Alan's sons, Ethan and Grant, moved away, distancing themselves from the scandal that had consumed their family. Their visits to their father in prison were rare and strained, each conversation marked by a sense of betrayal and loss that could never fully be reconciled. Vanessa, though physically healed, carried the scars of that February night. She chose to leave Maplewood, starting anew in a different state, far from the memories of a life that had ended the moment she woke to see her husband standing over her with a knife. She became a quiet advocate for victims of domestic violence, speaking at support groups and working with charities to provide resources for those trapped in toxic relationships. It was not the life she had imagined, but it was a life rebuilt on her own terms, free from the shadows that had haunted her for so long. For Detective Henry Collins, the case became a defining moment in his career. The investigation had pushed him to the edge, testing his instincts and his ability to read between the lines of a carefully orchestrated facade. He continued his work in law enforcement, but the Thorne case remained with him, a reminder of how easily truth could be twisted and hidden behind the most convincing lies. It was not an easy victory, but it was a victory nonetheless, one that reaffirmed his belief in the pursuit of justice, no matter how difficult the road. The Maplewood community eventually moved on, though the story of Alan Thorne and Vanessa Cruz remained a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the most picture-perfect lives could conceal unimaginable secrets. The trial faded from the headlines, and new stories took its place. But those who had been touched by the events would never forget the lessons learned. Behind every facade, there can be shadows. And sometimes those shadows hide the darkest parts of a human soul. parts that, once revealed, can never be hidden again. The story has been edited to ensure personal privacy and security regarding names and locations. Thanks for watching. If you like the video, don't forget to subscribe to see the latest and most thrilling family crime stories.